Hello again. I am the ADHD engineer, and I'd like to thank you for joining me. For years, I've struggled with many problems and behaviors that I thought were due to a lack of discipline in myself. This naturally led to a great deal of frustration, self-deprecation, and shame. If only I'd known that there was an underlying root cause that tied together many seemingly unrelated patterns, I might have sought treatment years ago. This leads to even more internal conflict now, those same feelings of frustration, self-deprecation, and shame. What kind of a person could I be? How might I have grown? What could I have accomplished? Who could I have impacted if I'd realized and sought treatment for my neurodivergence earlier? Maybe this is something you're going through right now. Maybe you suspect that you're neurodivergent, but you're not sure. Whatever brought us together today, I'm glad you're here. Many times in my life, I've displayed an extreme lack of social tact. I'm not by nature a rude person. I tend to be very empathetic and understanding, as well as well-mannered by societal standards. However, some of the manifestations of my ADHD are not so polite. I have often found myself speaking at an unreasonable volume, which I always attributed to having older parents who enjoyed rock concerts in their younger years. As I've discovered this year in my research, one of the symptoms of ADHD can be increased volume and variability in pitch when speaking. It's kind of annoying, but not the end of the world. Slightly more than annoying is my habit of interrupting people mid-sentence, or finishing their sentences for them. If you're watching this video with the playback speed set to 2, you can probably understand the feelings that cause this. Oftentimes, I wish I could adjust the playback speed in real life. Many conversations just feel too slow for me, and a part of my brain is willing to commit whatever faux pas is necessary to speed things along a bit. Many people, both neurotypical and neurodivergent, find this extremely off-putting, disrespectful, or even malicious. Some conversations, no matter how much I wish they would speed up, must continue at what I consider to be an inordinately slow progression, and no amount of interruption or verbal autocomplete can change this. Suddenly, my mind decides that, well, if I'm stuck here, I might as well get something done. I can think through other, more interesting thoughts. Unfortunately, I'm usually woken from this reverie at the point where another person in the conversation asks for my input. I'm then forced to either admit that I wasn't fully paying attention, or make something up and hope for the best. Neither leads to an optimal outcome. Even if I can pay partial attention to a conversation, there's a very high likelihood that I'll miss the minutiae of instructions, or even entire steps. Mark Uzzell tells us that multitasking is merely the opportunity to screw up more than one thing at a time. Medication and metacognition have been key in allowing me to see these types of patterns and prevent them. I've been told by many people over the years that I'm a relatively calm and collected person. It has been profoundly difficult for me to reconcile that narrative with my wildly mercurial temperament. I feel that I can remain stoic and abide a good many things that would spur others to emotion. However, sometimes the smallest vexation can heave me into a state of ungovernable rage, or reduce me to a sobbing heap. These explosive outbursts are incredibly intense, pegging out the needle on my emotional tachometer. It usually takes a relatively short amount of time for me to get over it. It's not generally so easy for those who have been affected by my outbursts. When my agency over my own emotions is stripped from me, and I behave abhorrently because of it, I feel entirely justified in the moment. It's only when the epinephrine finally dissipates that I start to grasp the consequences of my emotional dysregulation and become overwhelmed by shame. Medication has played a huge role in helping me to stay emotionally regulated, but as with most things, there's always work to be done. Something that I find both very interesting and very unfortunate is that while it's a very common symptom of ADHD, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5, the gold standard by which mental disorders are diagnosed, omits emotional dysregulation entirely from the list of ADHD symptoms. The way that I cope with my idleness is like a coin, two opposite sides joined by a common thread. I'll start with the physical side. A mildly annoying quirk to those around me has always been my various forms of self-pacification that are sometimes called stimming. These are devices that I use subconsciously to attempt to work off spurious energy, abate anxiety, or direct focus. Oftentimes, when I'm focusing on a particularly heady task, especially when I'm sitting in front of the computer, I chew on my fingers. As you may be able to see, my thumb and my index finger are heavily calloused from decades of being chewed upon during times of intense focus. I'm also often asked by my wife to stop jackrabbiting while I'm sitting. The perpetual foot tapping, wagging, and bouncing greatly annoy her and many other people due to the sound, visual distraction, and movement of nearby objects that these stimming behaviors cause. Another prominent stimming behavior that I exhibit is fidgeting. I feel uncomfortable if I don't have something to manipulate with my hands, even if it means manipulating my hands with themselves or each other. This is a device I actually like. I feel that the need to gesticulate during conversation adds character, personality, and flair to my conversations. But I understand that this can be off-putting to some people. These types of stimming behaviors are often confused with inattentiveness, which can lead to others feeling that their counterpart in the conversation is just waiting for the interaction to be over and really doesn't value what they have to say. The mental and emotional side of this coin is best exemplified in story form. It's Saturday morning, I have no plans for the day, no responsibilities, my chores are caught up, nothing is expected of me today. My eyes flutter open, I glance at my alarm clock, it's 6:20 a.m. Got a good night of sleep, my wife and son are still asleep. Some people would take this as an opportunity to lie in bed and prepare themselves for the day. Other people would get up and sit on the porch watching the world float by as they enjoy a hot mug of their favorite morning beverage. This isn't what I do. Trust me, I would like to, and I've tried. Due to the nature of the way my brain is wired, I immediately begin to feel a sense of anxiety if I suddenly find myself without task or purpose. If I attempt to override my programming and abide this anxiety, it eventually steps out of the way for its big brother depression, who proceeds to beat me about the head with a pogo stick, thereby winning the schoolyard fight in the metaphorical playground of my mind. From here, there are two paths. The first path is that I'm driven to action, no matter what that action is. It could be hyperfixating on a hobby or a project for a while. It could also be something truly useful, like washing up the dishes from dinner the night before, or finishing a chapter in whatever book has residence on my nightstand at the moment. Possibly the least constructive action that I'm often driven to is scrolling through Reddit or YouTube to satisfy my dopamine addiction. The other path, which is less desirable of the two, is that I was knocked out cold by the pogo stick, and I'm now unable to get out of bed or get off the couch. I feel like it would be nice to enjoy doing nothing sometimes, but unfortunately, that's something that I have yet to experience, even with the aid of medication. There are plenty of times in life where I appreciate this drive to do something, anything, because the hyper-focus that it brings has helped me to execute necessary tasks with laser beam focus and surgical precision. However, it can also backfire if something else more interesting catches my eye. My mind doesn't care what occupies it, as long as whatever does occupy it is currently the most interesting thing available. As I alluded to earlier, I often hyperfixate on things, and most of these things are rather ephemeral. Whether it's a hobby, project, or even an idea. If my mind chooses to hyperfixate on something, all else falls flat before it. This often leads me to misprioritize things. Logically, I know that things should be prioritized in order of importance, ability, and time constraint. Unfortunately, there's an override programmed into my brain. Regardless of my knowledge of a reasonable prioritization formula, my brain prefers to prioritize tasks from most to least interesting. Procrastination and broken deadlines follow quickly behind. To further complicate the issue, the thousands of tiny bean counters in my head that make up my executive function are constantly rescoring tasks to make sure they're still interesting. Unfortunately, this can happen in the middle of a hyperfixation, which leads me to losing interest as quickly as I became obsessed. I've left hundreds of hobbies and projects in my wake over the years, and while I do generally come back to them at some point, this can be a great source of frustration to those around me. Usually because something needs to be done urgently, and I have to be badgered to get the task done in a timely manner. All of this comes together and makes me feel lazy because I never seem to get anything done. I constantly spin my tires, always doing something, but never accomplishing most of what I set out to do. Before my diagnosis, and even now sometimes, this leaves me feeling pretty shameful and undisciplined. Sometimes the inability to prioritize tedious tasks can affect job performance. At my last job, spreadsheets were the bane of my existence. I spent several hours each day working on them, with much of the labor being manual input. I would often reach for other more interesting tasks just to pull me away from the spreadsheets. This, however, gave way to another benefit of ADHD. What's more interesting than spreadsheets? Programming. What could I do to procrastinate while still doing something to ensure the spreadsheets got completed? write programs and macros to automate the spreadsheet work. By the time I left my prior station, about 95% of the manual work that I had previously dreaded was automated, and the spreadsheets were automatically sent to whatever parties needed them each morning. I find that it's difficult to maintain my mental health without constantly having something to look forward to. This has led to several problems, such as addiction and irresponsible spending habits. You don't have anything to look forward to? How about the next dose of nicotine? The next Amazon purchase arriving? Additionally, I often find myself having an incredibly difficult time saying no to a purchase. I mean, that could be an Amazon goodie, like I said before, or it could be something interesting that I see while shopping for pants. Some people call this retail therapy. A shiny new bauble, or a gadget, or a tool, or whatever it may be, is an instant hit of that delicious dopamine that my brain craves so badly. A lack of impulse control has very often left me with buyer's remorse and intense feelings of shame. I'm sure you see a pattern here. Sometimes I've deprived myself of things that I really wanted because I was unable or unwilling to see that what I was doing wouldn't make me happy in the long run. I'm reminded of a gem of wisdom from Neil A. Maxwell. Never give up what you want most for what you want today. Medication has done very little to help with my lack of impulse control, but I'm much better equipped to manage it now that I'm more aware of it. Have you ever just skimmed over an email and fired off a quick reply, only to realize later that you missed important context that would have informed your response? What about being so excited to finally get to your destination that you jump out and realize you just locked your keys in your car? These aren't just hypothetical situations, they're the most prominent examples of careless mistakes that I've made time and time again. Everyone misses things occasionally, but for me, it seems to be a constant state of being sometimes. The way that I've most often seen this being expressed in conversation is, well, blank is smart, but they need to focus or apply themselves. Unfortunately, it's hard for neurotypical people to understand that for someone with ADHD, asking them to just focus or just apply themselves is the same thing as telling someone with depression to just focus on the positive, or telling someone with hearing damage to just listen better. There's so much shame and stigma around patterns of careless mistakes. I've spent more hours of my life than I'd like to admit berating myself for my repeated oversights. Through medication and metacognition, I've been able to greatly reduce the frequency that I exhibit imprudence, but I still have a great deal of growth in that area to look forward to. Since my diagnosis, I've been perplexed by the fact that I was never able to see the traits of ADHD in my behaviors and mannerisms, but now that I've started to accept that my mind is atypical, I can't seem to stop finding examples of my neurodivergence. A story comes to mind. The subject of this story, Filippo Brunelleschi, was a young Italian architect who designed a massive dome for the Florence Cathedral. The dome that he proposed was both extremely heavy and quite unusual for the architecture of the time. This makes sense, as Brunelleschi is now often regarded as a founding father of Renaissance architecture. When city officials asked him to see his models and schematics, he refused, insisting instead on a game of intellect. The city officials were intrigued. Producing a chicken's egg, Brunelleschi asserted that whomever among them could take this egg and make it stand upright should have enough understanding of architecture, design, and the natural forces that act against them to design the cupola for the Florence Cathedral. Each one tried, and each one failed. Sometimes after a very long time. Finally, annoyed, they passed the egg back to Brunelleschi and demanded that he make the egg stand. Smiling, he gently rapped one end of the egg on the marble table before him. That end of the egg was flattened, and it stood. Further perturbed, the council admonished him, saying that any one of them could have done the same thing. Laughing, Brunelleschi agreed, saying that they also could have raised the cupola had they possessed his models and designs. This probably seems a little bit whimsical and much like showmanship, but I promise there's a point. In this story, the city council demonstrates the same outcome bias and historian's fallacy that I'm guilty of now. Having seen it, I can't unsee it, and no matter how many red flags I realize I missed, fixating on them now won't do me any good. A Chinese philosopher once said that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. If throughout this video you recognize some of your own patterns and behaviors, I encourage you to speak to your healthcare provider and start the conversation. I plan on posting new content weekly. Due to the nature of this channel, there will be no set patterns, as the content that I create will be driven by the whims of my atypical mind. I won't be telling you what to do. I won't tell you how to fix yourself or that you don't need to be fixed. I can't diagnose you with anything. I'm just here to be a friend to those who need one and to share my experience. Everything here is intended only for the sake of satisfying curiosity, whether it be yours or mine. This video is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. You should always understand that past performance is not necessarily indicative of future results, and your mileage may vary greatly. While people with ADHD are considered atypical, I've found that there is no such thing as a typical case in the wild. If what I'm doing speaks to you, please like the video and subscribe below. If there's anything you'd like me to talk about, any questions you have for me, or feedback in general, feel free to leave a comment below. Let's do something wonderful together.